Chapter 33. Cold. The only thought, feeling, or sensation that came to Sarah was of the wet, frozen, bitter cold that seeped into her bones and caused her to shiver uncontrollably in her restraints. She was still wet from the waterboarding, and the bastards had turned the air conditioning to full blast. The combination of which made for a harsh, uncomfortable experience even between the bouts of interrogation. She had to consciously fight to stop her teeth from chattering. Beside her, she could hear Savannah crying, sobbing loudly to herself. Sarah hated herself for it. She couldn't have prevented them from torturing the poor girl. No matter what she'd told them, they'd have done it to her anyway that first time, just to show they meant business. But she'd been torn between protecting John and looking after Savannah, and her indecisiveness had been costly. They'd continued on relentlessly. Waterboarding Savannah a number of times, not even bothering to ask Sarah anything and ignoring her shouts, screams, and finally her desperate pleas to leave her alone. "Savannah, are you okay?" she asked, looking across at the shivering, wretched form of the minute redhead on the table next to hers. "I want to go home," Savannah sobbed, tears streaming from her eyes. She'd been crying for an hour straight and repeating those same 5 words over and over, and Sarah felt guilty that it was starting to grate her nerves, adding to the list of things she felt bad about already. "Why are they hurting us?" she asked. She didn't know what she'd done wrong or why they were hurting her. "They want John," Sarah said simply. "We'll go home soon," she added, trying to sound reassuring. She looked around the room again, searching for anything that could help her to escape, just in case she missed it on the previous umpteen times she tried. There was nothing at all, not even a paperclip. She reckoned Kaliba must know about her knack for survival and prepared accordingly. Either that, or the slaphead machine that had done most of the interrogating was just being meticulous. It was hard to tell which, not that it mattered. The machine in question stood in the corner watching them, approached upon hearing her words about going home. "You can go home when you tell us the location of your son, Catherine Weaver, and the AI." Bullshit, Sarah thought. If they found John, she knew both her and Savannah would be executed and buried out in the desert. Until then, you will continue to suffer. Baldy grabbed the hose again and held it over Savannah, but looked towards Sarah. She watched in horror as the machine went about its work and fastened another length of cling film over Savannah's face, and Sarah started to cry herself. "Okay," she said to Baldy, a few tears rolling down her cheeks. For days she'd had to watch as the machine tortured Savannah. Luckily, she'd passed out quickly each time, a small mercy, but that hadn't made either of their suffering any easier. After the last bout, Sarah had decided it was time to say something. They'd been interrogated for 2 days, and she reckoned if she gave them something now, they might believe it. Baldy put the hose down and moved towards her. She noticed that he didn't shiver from the cold like she and Savannah did, a flaw in their infiltration capabilities, and one that could be used to spot them, she thought, assuming I live long enough to tell anyone. "Please be more specific," Baldy said to her. "I'll tell you something if you leave her alone," she gestured towards Savannah. "What information do you have?" Sarah gulped and tried to calm herself. He could read her like a book, the same way Cameron could. Baldy put a hand on her arm and she knew what he was doing, scanning her for any signs of deceit. She'd been thinking hard about a story, and had repeated it over and over to herself in her head. She knew she had to all but believe it herself to pass muster with the machine, and the best lies were based on some truth. "We had a house in the Calabasas Highlands," Sarah said, trying hard to picture the house they'd moved to after John's 16th birthday. She knew that what she'd said was technically true. That had been their home for a good while. "We used it before I was arrested." She imagined the living room, where they hadn't spent much time, the bathroom, and how she'd scrubbed the dried blood off the floor from Riley's suicide attempt, and their neighbor Cassie. She tried to vividly imagine every detail in her mind's eye. "Believe it yourself and they'll believe it," he told herself. "Why didn't you tell us before?" Baldy asked. Sarah had to laugh. Surely that was so obvious it didn't need to be explained even to a machine. Cameron understood it. "He's my son," she replied, incredulous she had to spell it out for the tin can. "Why would I give him up?" "Indeed," the Terminator said simply. though the tone of his voice was what caught Sarah, the question he didn't need to ask. Why would you give him up now? That one word caught Sarah off guard, and she realized the machine had just been playing dumb, had led her into it. She'd underestimated the Terminator, and she couldn't afford to do so again. She looked across to Savannah, who watched them with tears dropping from her eyes as she whimpered silently, her voice stolen by the cling film sealed across her lips. "To save her," she said, swallowing a lump of guilt for what Savannah had been through, and what else she'd doubtlessly be forced to endure. "Leave her alone, let her go, and I'll tell you more. Give me the address and tell me how many accomplices John has, and Savannah Weaver won't be harmed anymore." "She needs to eat," Sarah added, both for Savannah's sake and because she figured trying to bargain might make her seem more convincing than giving it up front. "Food and water. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. The human body can last several weeks without food," Baldy countered. "She'll survive. She eats or no deal," Sarah glared at him. The T-888 stared back, not looking particularly impressed. "If there's no deal, I'll resume the interrogation." "Just give her some food," Sarah shot at the machine. Baldy paused for a moment. He hadn't expected Sarah to bargain with him like this. Her position was highly dubious, and he could easily ignore it and continue to torture the child. It would achieve the same results ultimately. "Tell me how many occupants and I'll arrange for food." "Just Cameron and Danny Dyson," Sarah sighed. "Cameron?" Baldy looked at her, confused. He was unaware of any associates named Cameron. "The Tin Miss Terminator. She calls herself Cameron." Baldy found that very unusual. Machines didn't give themselves names except to use as an alias. John and Sarah were clearly aware of the machine's identity, so why did it continue to use a name when it wasn't necessary? There was a more pressing question, however. "Where are Catherine Weaver and James Ellison? We know the AI was present at your safe house before we captured you. Where is it now?" "What fucking AI?" Sarah racked her brain trying to work it out. "You mean John Henry?" she asked. Another machine that assigned a name for itself, Baldy thought. Such free-thinking machines were a danger to Skynet. They couldn't be allowed to exist. "Yes, where is it?" Sarah realized the extent of what the 888 was asking, even if it wasn't aware of it. As John had told her, John Henry had merged into Cameron, become a part of her, and the liquid metal masquerading as Catherine Weaver had given her some serious upgrades to be able to take on Skynet. If they knew where Cameron was then, they'd stop at nothing to destroy her, and in doing so they'd find John. "I don't know where Weaver and Ellison are," Sarah said. "I told you they left." They never said where they were going. The AI's in Calabasas with John. She looked up at the machine and wondered, "Why's this AI so important? I thought it was John who was the biggest threat." Kaliba had invested so much in trying to eliminate Weaver and Zyra Corp and this John Henry AI, but she hadn't thought until now why exactly. Kyle had told her John beat the machines. Surely he was their main target. John Connor led the human resistance against the machines. His strategy of reprogramming captured Terminators was effective. An AI allied with John Connor, controlling machines for the resistance, is a threat to Skynet. Jesus, Sarah mulled over the implication of his words. John allied with an AI was the ultimate threat to the machines. Cameron. The machine didn't know it, but they were talking about Cameron. She'd felt sick to her stomach seeing her son naked with the Terminator, but she'd decided to allow it, for John's sake. The fact that not only was John so dependent on Cameron, but that the fate of the entire human race could soon balance on his son's closeness with her was deeply, deeply disturbing. Baldy paused for a moment before deciding on the next course of action. He went back over to Savannah and picked up the hose. Savannah struggled and turned her head away, but Baldy reached out and pinned her in place with his free hand and held the hose up above her. "I told you where he is," Sarah protested. "I told you." "I want the address," Baldy said. 113 Freemason Way, Sarah snapped, remembering their old address. "Just leave her alone." The Terminator dropped the hose to the ground, ripped the cling film from Savannah's face, about turned to the door and promptly left Sarah and Savannah alone in the room. The young redhead started sobbing and crying again, and watching her almost reduced the older woman to tears. Sarah stared up at the ceiling and realized this was it for them. She knew the machine had gone to verify her story, but it wouldn't take them long to realize she was lying. There was no way of her getting free, and once Caliber realized she was screwing them around, they were done for. They'd torture Savannah even worse than before, in front of her eyes, until either she told them where John was, which she couldn't, or until the girl died or was as good as dead. At which point they'd both get a bullet lodged in their skulls, stuffed into garbage bags and buried out in the desert, unless they found a way out. No fate but what we make, Sarah recited in her head. She certainly wasn't going to resign herself to dying here. He's going to come back, Savannah said between sobs. Don't let him hurt me, she cried, looking down the side of her bed to the hosepipe on the floor. Just the sight of it sent shivers up her spine and made her want to curl into a ball, close her eyes and cry. Restrained, she could only manage 2 of the 3. Make him stop. I can't, Sarah said, trying not to snap. She felt bad for Savannah, but she needed a clear head to work out what she was going to do next. She couldn't think if all she could hear was crying. She looked down and examined her restraints, wide leather straps around her wrists, ankles, and another over her chest, keeping her flat against the bed and pinning her arms to her side. She had very little freedom of movement, with only a little bit of leeway in her forearms. The straps held her arms by her side and kept her hands from being able to meet, and another belt connected the 2 leather shackles together in the middle, preventing her from moving her arms outwards too much. Essentially, she had a couple inches of movement either way. She looked to Savannah, however, and didn't see the same kind of gear on her. Can you move your hands? She asked. A little, Savannah sniffled. Sarah lowered her voice, unsure if they had microphones in the room as well as the camera. We're gonna get out of here, I promise, she said quietly, iron in her voice. I can't guarantee they won't come back before then, but if they do, I need you to be really big and brave. Can you do that for me? Savannah looked over to Sarah and nodded slowly. "'Kay," she said, keeping her voice down to match Sarah's. I just need to work out how to get out of here, then we're home free, Sarah said, hoping she sounded more positive than she felt. She decided not to tell her that they'd also have to somehow get past Kaliba's private army and a 888, and even if they managed all that, they were in the middle of nowhere, and she had no idea how to get back to the world or go about finding John. If only I had a paperclip, she muttered, remembering how she'd sprung similar restraints at Pescadero with ease. Her young companion said nothing but started to fidget and wriggle in her bed slightly. What are you doing? Sarah asked, watching as Savannah twisted her arm. She'd simply been handcuffed to the bed, and chains on the cuffs gave her more room to maneuver than Sarah had, but it still wasn't enough. She wriggled her body, trying to get her hips closer to her hands. They'll see, Sarah hissed. She locked eyes with Savannah and glanced up to the camera, making sure she followed her gaze. Nodding, Savannah lay still for a moment, breathing deeply and nervously. She was scared, but she saw Sarah being strong. She thought of John, Cameron, and the other Savannah, and they were all strong. They wouldn't cry like she had. She wished she could be more like them. They'd know what to do. She glanced to her left and saw Sarah lying motionless on her back, and she did the same. After a minute, she slowly reached her hand into her pocket and pulled something out. Sarah slowly, subtly turned her head towards her and watched as she pulled out something small and metallic. What is that? She asked. I took a penknife from the closet, Savannah told her. She'd seen the other Savannah, always carrying a knife. She'd seen how the older, bigger girl had hidden one in her long hair. She liked the other Savannah, wanted to be more like her, and when she'd hidden in the closet, trying to stay still and quiet like Sarah had said, she'd spotted the knife and pocketed it a moment before the men had found her. Clever girl, Sarah suppressed a smile, not knowing how much detail the camera could pick up. Maybe the 2 Savannahs weren't so different after all. She didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but right now she took it as a stroke of luck that Savannah had thought to take it. Can you throw it here? She asked. I think so. She wasn't sure. She couldn't move her arms very much. I need you to throw it to me, Sarah said. But you have to make sure it lands on me. Savannah's only response was to nod nervously. She didn't want to miss, she didn't want to stay here, and that meant getting it right. She knew she only had one chance. She couldn't lift her arm up to toss it to her, making it an even harder thing to do. She held the penknife in her hand and flicked it out quickly, releasing the tool and letting it arc into the air. It landed with a soft bump on the mattress between Sarah's right arm and her side, just down from her hand. "Good throw," she said encouragingly, and reached her fingers out for it, grasping it and clutching it in her hand as quickly as she could, just hoping it wasn't noticed. Slowly, one-handed, she flicked the blade out and dug the tip into the leather. She pushed and twisted with some effort, working to dig a groove into it. No good, she thought after a couple of minutes. The strap was too thick, the blade too dull, and she couldn't get a decent enough leverage to put pressure on and stab through. She twisted it more and slowly maneuvered the tip of the blade until it pushed against one of the notch holes used to fasten it, deciding that would be a better chance of pushing the blade in and starting to cut. Again, slowly, she started to push and twist to widen the hole. It's going to take a while. 5 people stuck into one car for a long time was not Ellison's idea of fun. The air conditioning was on full blast to try and combat the combined heat from the air outside and the 5 bodies stuffed inside. None of them had showered in nearly 2 days, and the smell of so many bodies cooped up together was powerful, especially between Savannah and John, who weren't yet acclimatized to the California heat. The sooner they get used to it, the better, he thought. Still, he considered himself lucky that at least he was in the front of the car rather than stuffed into the back. He and Savannah were sat up front, since they were the least likely to be recognized. Kaliba's mercenaries would be looking for John and probably Cameron. They'd all seen Danny before at the Kaliba complex, so he was too much of a risk, so that left him. And Savannah, who didn't even exist in this timeline apart from as a 7-year-old girl already in their capture. She could move around freely, and nobody would pay her any attention. He just hoped the cheap pair of sunglasses he was wearing helped to disguise his face from the casual observation of any mercenaries they might come across. "Relax," John said from the back seat, sat between Cameron to his left and Danny on the right. "They won't expect us here." He reckoned they'd be safe as long as they remained in the car and didn't draw attention to themselves. They were in the parking lot, where he and his mom had done recon only a few days ago, though he found it hard to believe it wasn't another lifetime. "As if I haven't had enough of those already." Cameron felt John's pulse against her thigh and was surprised he was so calm considering the situation. She watched carefully and scanned all activity she could see in the airport, both people and aircraft, and looked out for any signs they were being watched. "We're on the run, right?" Savannah turned and said to Ellison. "Who's going to be stupid enough to come right where Kaliba lands?" "Someone who's planning to attack them," Cameron answered. "Is that what you do?" Danny asked her. Cameron nodded. "If this wasn't a rescue, yes." Ellison turned around and looked at her, curious. "What would you do if this wasn't a rescue mission?" "Control Air Force unmanned aircraft and launch airstrikes against Kaliba, or wait for the helicopter to arrive and shoot it down with the rocket launcher or a grenade." They'd learnt that Kaliba had 24 mercenaries. If they operated in teams of 6 or 8, then she could eliminate 25 to 33% of their force with a single shot. "Well, it is a rescue mission," John said, irritably. It didn't matter what they'd do in another situation, and he found himself taking it personally that people were asking Cameron what she'd do when he was the one in charge. He had the most at stake here. It was his mom imprisoned by them, his life Kaliba wanted to terminate, and his fate on the line here. "My fate, my rules. We need the helicopter and we need the pilot. Can't you download a flight manual or something?" Danny asked Cameron. She saw John's irritation and realized that Danny and also Ellison had unwittingly undermined his position. He hadn't asked to be in charge, but he was. He knew the others had doubts, and she considered this line of discussion could be damaging his confidence. There were practical reasons as to why Danny's idea was infeasible. Flight manuals weren't published online for security reasons. If she tried and Skynet detected it, then it would put them in danger. And if she hypothetically succeeded, chances were Kaliba would interrogate any incoming aircraft. But she decided there was a much better response. "John's plan will work," she said, turning to him and meeting his gaze. He didn't smile, she noticed, but the dark, hard look in his eyes softened slightly. "I told you before, Danny, if you're in, you're all in. You had the chance to leave and you stayed." He almost said that if Danny backed out now, he'd shoot him, but didn't. He knew Cameron had a point. He'd been high-strung lately, though. How the hell he was supposed to be otherwise when Kaliba had his mom? He didn't know, and threatening the others wouldn't exactly instill any faith. He remembered what Derek had told him before. "If you're asking me if everyone agrees with everything you do, of course not." He realized that even though they'd had doubts and they'd had questions about his mental state, they were still here. There was a difference, he realized, between faith and blind loyalty. "Turn the radio on while we wait," John said to Savannah. There was no point in them waiting in tense silence. In another car, parked on the opposite side of the lot, Knowles sat in the driver's seat and tapped his fingers against the wheel whilst listening intently to the same radio station that John and the others were tuning into, following the latest series of headlines hinting the world was starting to fall apart at the seams. There has still been no easing of the growing tensions between the U.S. and the Russian Federation. Further talks between Presidents Obama and Medvedev have reportedly resulted in no resolution of events. Defense sources have refused to rule out military action in response to the bombing of 4 radar sites in western Alaska, in which 4 Air Force personnel lost their lives. In addition to the upgrading to DEFCON 3, the highest level of readiness since 9/11, we have also learnt that the Navy has rerouted a number of vessels already patrolling in the Pacific to the north, possibly to intercept and engage any potential follow-up attacks. However, in a press statement, the president was keen to stress that we're not at war, and this is just a precaution. He recently told reporters that he's confident the situation can be resolved peacefully. Sources in Russia, however, seem less optimistic. "We're gonna kill ourselves off before Skynet even gets a chance," he muttered as he looked out the windshield, searching for that familiar silver helicopter. Maybe it's not a bad thing, he thought. The worse it gets, the more forces will be mobilized. They'd be away from their home bases and might survive the nuclear blasts Sarah Connor had predicted. Or it could just bring the whole thing forward that much sooner. In response to the Russian airstrikes in Alaska, sources in the Pentagon have reported that they have a potential new weapon. The Skynet defense system, a controversial artificial intelligence that, according to our experts, will be able to monitor all U.S. airspace as well as coordinating air, sea, and land forces manned and unmanned both at home and abroad, as well as space assets, and taking responsibility for all aspects of cyber warfare. The vote on whether or not to pass the bill has been forwarded, and it's predicted strongly that Congress will vote in favor. He ignored the rest of the broadcast, knowing that if he was successful that it wouldn't be an issue anyway, and if he failed then he wouldn't be around to see how it all turned out. He looked left and right, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Connors. It was a busy day at the airport, small aircraft landing and taking off charter flights, flying lessons and so on, he reckoned. He didn't hold out much hope that he'd spot them just wandering around. The one thing he'd learnt about Sarah Connor was that she knew how to go to ground. He reckoned he wouldn't see anything of them until the chopper landed and they went for it. He didn't actually know they were here. It was just his gut feeling, but 18 years as a Marine had taught him to trust his instincts. The sound of rotor blades caught his attention, and he looked out the windshield to see the tiny form of a helicopter approaching from the northeast. As it came closer, the whirring grew much louder, into a constant drone, and he saw the familiar silver shape that had ferried him from the airport to Kaliba's complex, and back again numerous times. He grabbed the long black bag full of his guns and held it tightly in his grip. He'd changed back into his black tactical clothes and had his combat vest on, minus his helmet, which was in the bag. He had a sweater on over the vest, so as not to attract too much attention. To the casual observer who didn't look too closely, he'd be just a large, bulky, unfashionable 40-something, one of many around here, he thought as he looked out at the people walking around. It took a minute or so for the helicopter to descend and gently kiss the ground. The moment it did, one of the doors slid open and 6 men, several of whom Knowles recognized, jumped out. They all carried bags which he knew would have their tactical gear and their weapons inside. Being only a small airport that hosted just internal, regional flights, and seeing as the helicopter was a private aircraft, they didn't bother going into the terminal and headed straight for the exit. Knowles turned off the radio and remained still and silent in his car, keeping his head bowed and suddenly finding the steering wheel very interesting as it hopefully kept his face obscured from vision. The team went right behind his car and moved to a waiting vehicle at the other side of the parking lot. Seizing his chance, Knowles opened the door to his car and got out, taking the bag of guns with him. He quickly marched to the grassy area and went through the gate into the airfield. He didn't look back in case any of the team did the same and recognized him. Instead, he tried to look relaxed and calm, just like any of the other guys here on business or here for a flying lesson. The helicopter's engines started to whine and grew several pitches higher, and he broke into a jog towards it. He definitely couldn't afford to miss this flight. As he approached, he unzipped his bag, took a quick look around to make sure nobody was watching, and pulled open the door to the cockpit with one hand, whilst in the same motion pulling out the HKG-36 and thrusting it forward. The pilot snapped to the side and stared at Knowles, his eyes wide as he recoiled in horror. He looked at the ex-Marine, then down at the assault rifle aimed at his chest and back at Knowles. "What the hell? Don't take off," Knowles commanded as he pulled himself into the seat next to the pilot and closed the door after him. Knowles. The pilot gaped still in disbelief, just barely recognizing the man but knowing he wasn't on Kaliba's list of approved guests anymore. He went for his radio, but Knowles shoved the barrel hard into his neck. "Easy," he said slowly. "If I pull the trigger now, your head will just pop off. You want that?" The pilot shook his head slowly. "I thought so. Keep the rotors whirling, but don't take off. And the moment I think you're trying anything funny." He mimed pulling the trigger with his free hand, then mimed an explosion next to his head. "Sure," he nodded. "Just do what you've got to do, man. I'm just a pilot." "Like I'm just a mercenary," Knowles growled. Both of them were just expendable assets to Kaliba. He'd learnt it the hard way, but he doubted the pilot was aware of that. "What do you want?" the pilot asked. He'd heard of carjacking and people hijacking planes, but never a helicopter. "Tell me where you want to go, we'll go." "Not yet," Knowles said, looking out through the clear glass windows to the airport. "We're waiting for a couple of passengers." "Heads up." Savannah broke the silence and looked out the windscreen as the helicopter landed on the ground and the mercenaries filed out. She didn't point because she didn't want to attract anyone's attention. It was possible, however unlikely, that Kaliba already had a presence on the ground, waiting to meet the chopper team, and she wasn't going to risk it even on the off chance. They waited in terse silence as the guns for hire strolled through the airfield, out through the gates and to the other side of the parking lot. John looked out behind him and saw the men opening the doors to an SUV and decided it was now or never. "Drive," he told Savannah, "straight for the chopper." Savannah pushed down on the gas and rolled the car forward, bumping as they ran over the curb and onto the grassy verge of the airfield. No vehicles were allowed on the airfield or the strip, but she ignored it, seeing it more as a guideline than a rule, and plowed through the gate, building up speed as she went. "You're gonna hit someone." Danny shouted out as Savannah drove like a madwoman through the airfield. Savannah ignored him and kept her foot on the gas, pushing it all the way to the floor as she steered towards the helicopter and slammed on the horn. "Move." She screamed out her window at everyone around her, though people were already running for their lives from the psycho driver, some narrowly avoiding being hit by a matter of inches. John grinned from the back seat. Never underestimate people's ability to get out of the way when some idiot bore down on them in a car, he thought. The one thing people were pretty good at was self-preservation. Within seconds, the car had reached the helicopter, and Savannah pulled it into a handbrake turn, swinging the trunk around so it was closer to the bird. Straight away, all 4 car doors opened and everyone sprung out, John being the last to leave, having been stuck in the middle of the back seat. "Savannah, Ellison, and Danny, grab the weapons. We'll secure the chopper." He and Cameron ran towards the helicopter. He pulled open the door to reveal another man already holding an assault rifle at the pilot. The man immediately swung his rifle around as John drew down his pistol at the man, and for a moment their eyes locked. "John fucking Connor." The man breathed out a sigh of relief and chuckled to himself as he lowered his gun. John continued to stare suspiciously at the stranger and kept his own weapon pointed at the man, not knowing who the hell he was even if the other guy recognized him. "And you are Andy Knowles. Your mom will probably recognize me." "Sarah Connor's not here," Cameron said, holding her own weapon pointed at Knowles' head. "Who are you?" She didn't know who this man was, and he could be a potential danger to them. "This isn't going according to plan," Knowles said to himself. "Get in." He stuck his thumb out towards the passenger area behind him. "Tell us who you are first," John shot back. "Or better yet, get out." He turned his head and saw Ellison, Savannah and Danny ferrying the weapons, ammo and vests from the trunk into the passenger area of the helicopter. There were also people milling around, staring at them. Driving through an airport and nearly running people over's going to turn a lot of heads, he thought. Police were probably on their way right now, and they had to be airborne and out of here before they arrived. Cameron reached forward to grab Knowles and throw him out, but John stopped her. "Get in!" He mirrored Knowles' words as he backed away and pulled himself into the passenger area at the back. Ellison passed up the M240 to him, and he placed it onto the floor as Savannah jumped in with the LAW in her hands. "That's the last of it," she said, and looked down at the arsenal at their feet. 3 M4s, 3 ACs, 1 machine gun, 1 sniper rifle, and 1 rocket launcher. Not much, but it would have to do. She remembered the thermite grenade in her thigh pocket and put her hand over it, making sure it was still there and safe. Cameron, Ellison, and Danny got into the chopper and closed the door, sealing them inside. Knowles slipped between the 2 front seats and got into the rear, sitting himself next to John. "Take off and head for Kaliba," John ordered the pilot. "I'll know if you take us the wrong way," Cameron added, pointing her pistol at him. Okay, keep your pants on, I'm just a pilot." He nodded and turned back to the controls. He had no clue what the hell all this was about. He was just paid to fly the birds. He flipped a number of switches and pressed down on the pedals, spinning the rotors faster and generating enough lift to rise up into the air. As they ascended, Cameron spotted several police cars with flashing sirens arrive. It didn't matter. They wouldn't shoot a helicopter down even if they could, and very quickly they were airborne, ascending still as the pilot directed them northeast. Cameron looked out of the window as they flew over northern LA and once again intruded onto the defense network, knowing the reinforcements would soon become necessary. She accessed the UCAV controls in Creech Air Force Base and selected the aircraft she'd ordered armed, impersonating the Secretary of Defense with some clever forgery. She brought the unmanned drones to life and saw through the eyes of the security cameras how the Air Force technicians, engineers, and remote pilots gaped as the aircraft rolled out of the hangars seemingly of their own accord and taxied for takeoff. "So where's Sarah Connor?" Knowles asked. "How about you tell us who you are first?" Ellison replied. He looked at the man, wondering where he knew him from. It wasn't until Knowles took off his sweater to reveal a black tactical vest that he recognized him. "You're the mercenary working for Kaliba," he said. "The one we knocked out in the alley behind Zyra Corp." Instantly, Cameron and Savannah went for their weapons, but John stopped them. 5 against 1, he said calmly. "Tell us who you are and what you're doing here." "That's Sergeant Knowles," Danny said. "He's the one in charge of Kaliba's mercenaries." Again, the 2 girls' grips tightened around their weapons, and Knowles knew he had some explaining to do. I quit. Those bombs you left in the old house, they blew up my team when we went in to extract Danny." "Don't expect an apology," John replied darkly. "I'll cut a long story short. I found out one of them was a machine. I walked away, and they've been hunting me as well as you. I'm here to help." John hesitated, thinking about what to do with him, and Savannah and Cameron waited with hair triggers. Either one of them wouldn't wait a second to blow his head off and toss him out the side of the helicopter if he made a single wrong move, or if John gave them the word. Neither were murderers, but they had so much riding on this. One mistake, if this guy wasn't on the level, could repeat the future Savannah had barely survived. "What's in the bag?" John asked. On his question, Knowles picked up the bag he'd brought and opened it up. "I brought some toys that might help." Cameron snatched it from him and pulled out the contents. M1 Garand, Winchester shotgun, and Heckler & Koch HKG 36. She turned to Knowles with a blank, unimpressed look. "These won't work against a T-888, she told him, handing the weapons back. "A what?" he asked. T-888, Savannah explained. "Advanced infiltrators, smarter than the 800s but not as strong or well-armored." "What does work, then?" he asked. He'd figured the things would be tough, and he'd bought the best weapons a man could legally buy, things that'd knock a rhino off its feet. John patted the LAW, propped up on the floor against his seat. "One of these," he answered. He picked up one of the M4s and checked it over. "Or a few of these." He tapped the launcher with his finger. "Or her," he nodded at Cameron. "You," Knowles stared at the girl in confusion. What good was a 5'6", 110-pound 20-something girl going to do? "I'm the best weapon you have," Cameron said. She made her eyes glow blue, knowing from experience that seemed to be the best way to quickly prove she wasn't human. She picked up one of the AK-47s and readied it, then started to assemble the M240 machine gun. Savannah grabbed another M4 and loaded it, as Ellison donned one of the mercenaries' tactical vests and started to load M4 rifle magazines into it. John handed Danny one of the remaining 2 ACs and gave him 4 magazines, as well as a vest, and he clipped a set of webbing with a belt kit around his waist. Within moments, they were all armed to the teeth. John and Savannah with the M4/203s, Ellison with the plain assault rifle, Savannah and Danny with AK-47s. Cameron was tooled up to the nines, wielding the machine gun in her arms and the sniper rifle and rocket launcher on her back. They needed to be able to move quickly, so she'd taken the heaviest weapons to carry herself. John also kept the last AK and a number of magazines slung to his back, knowing his mom would be chomping at the bit to fight back once they sprang her free. Knowles, the stranger and newcomer, the outsider to the group, was left with the weapons he came with. "I take it you two know the layout of the place," John said to both Knowles and Danny. "You're probably better off with Danny showing you the way," Knowles replied. "The entire basement level was restricted access, and I'm just a hired gun." Danny had been one of the few given full clearance to the entire complex, whereas he'd been limited to the ground floor only. Any idea where they'd keep prisoners? John turned to the younger of the 2 former Kaliba employees. "I don't know," Danny shrugged apologetically. "There's 2 stories plus the basement. It's a big place, so they could be anywhere." He wished he could be more help. He was aware that since he'd decided to stay with them, he'd been next to useless. "Coleman," he realized. "He'll know." Must be a Gray, John thought. He realized the quickest way would be to catch either this Coleman or another Gray and grill them for information. The sheer fact they'd defected to Skynet to protect not just their own hides, but to spare themselves any kind of hardship indicated to him they'd be pretty weak-willed. They'd have a low tolerance for pain. They'd cave in easily. "What's going on now?" Coleman asked through half a mouthful of bagel from the complex's cafeteria. He moved from the doorway and stood beside a table, putting his plastic coffee cup down. Steroids, Baldy, and 2 of his colleagues, Townsend and Pierce, were stood and sat the humans sat. Cyborg stood up as usual in the AI room. He could see a number of lights on Skynet winking rapidly, indicating that it was very active and up to something. "Just look." Townsend pointed to one of the flat screens hung up on the wall. Coleman glanced up to it and saw a radar image of Eastern California/Western Nevada. At the far right was the Sierra Crest and Mount Whitney, close to where they were situated. There were a number of signatures moving on the screen, but one in particular was moving straight towards them. "Do we know what that is?" He asked the others, surprised they hadn't told him sooner. If someone had found their complex, then it could be extremely bad news. Even if it was just some tourists they might go and tell someone, word could get around about a building and a hangar in the middle of nowhere. Pierce smiled. It took off from Oxnard Airport. It's one of ours. But we received a transmission from inside the helicopter you'll want to hear. Skynet. An audio recording played out, and Coleman clearly heard the words John fucking Connor spoken by someone, just audible over the roar of the engine and the whirring of the rotor blades. Connor's taken the helicopter, he summarized. He's coming for his mother. His heart started to beat faster in his chest in nervous anticipation. Deep down inside, he felt a keen sense of fear starting to take root. John Connor, the bane of Skynet, the man who'd learnt to fight the machines. He was only a boy in this time, but he'd already evaded them numerous times and somehow defeated their ambush team. He'd never heard back from them. He'd tortured Sarah Connor and the poor girl to find out where he was, and now he was coming to them. All our work. He trailed off. For years, they'd put their hearts and souls into this. They'd expected to come up against Connor, but not like this. They should have hunted him down like a rat and exterminated him, not an open war like this was turning out to be, with the kid on the offensive. Relax, Townsend said casually, seeing Coleman starting to sweat. Skynet's taking care of it. Look at the screen again. He did, and he noticed a cluster of icons moving away from the Sierra crest, straight towards the helicopter. Skynet mobilized the dragonflies as soon as it detected the helicopter and learnt John Connor was inside it, Baldy said. It took a moment for it to sink into Coleman's skull, and he found himself grinning jubilantly as the icons raced towards each other. A small box on screen revealed the Skynet-controlled drone's ETA to target. 4 minutes. They won't know what hit them, Coleman grinned, the worry that had caught in the bottom of his chest dissipating. John Connor might be coming to wage war, but it was a fight for which he was ill-equipped. Whatever weapons he had on board, even his cyborg, would be no match for a dozen dragonflies. This would be over swiftly. Skynet, he said aloud, knowing the AI would recognize his voice. Patch me through to Sarah Connor's room. The second screen, next to the radar image, winked online and displayed the words intercom activated. Skynet definitely wasn't one for words, he thought. A moment later, the screen changed to show footage of the room where she was being held. He could see Nagace sat on a stood, looking at Sarah and Savannah, both tied down. Her face was turned away from the camera and neither captive was moving. Nagace, is Sarah conscious? She is, Nagace's reply came moments later. And she's still pissed that Baldy lied to her. I'm not surprised, Coleman chuckled. If the woman had really thought that making up some cock and bull story about a safe house in Calabasas would help her, then she'd certainly had another thing coming to her. She was still waiting for that food for Savannah, and once they'd verified she'd been lying, they'd turned the temperature down even more in the room. Sarah, can you hear me? Yes, she replied, her voice shaky, weak, but still he could tell that hint of defiance in her. Even after all she'd been through, he could guarantee if she found the slightest chance to break her bonds, she would, and she'd create a whole world of trouble for them. He watched the screen, and Sarah's head craned up, and she stared straight at the camera, and again he saw the flash of anger in her eyes. He knew that what was about to happen would crush that anger, that defiance, in an instant, and everything she'd ever fought for would be no more. I just wanted to inform you that your son's coming to rescue you. Why should I believe that? She asked. He's too smart to come after me. Well, apparently he's not as smart as you think. Part of him wished they had a display in the room they were holding her in so he could show her. He's coming for you and in. He looked at his watch. In a little over 3 minutes, he's going to be blown to pieces and scattered over the Mojave. Skynet. Disengage the intercom. The AI obliged, and the communication was terminated. He could see Sarah grimacing through the camera, however, and he felt an immense satisfaction that in moments the biggest threat ever to the project would soon be crashing down to Earth in a flaming wreck. Baldy, however, did not share the same excitement or sense of impending victory. Instead, he saw a security threat, no matter how small. He was nothing if not meticulous and switched on the intercom. Squads 2 and 3. Proceed to the front entrance and prepare to defend from attack. Townsend smirked at the machine and watched as the smaller of the two Terminators took an MP5 from the table, stuffed spare magazines into his pocket, and moved outside, sharing a look with steroids, who remained in place to protect Skynet. So paranoid, Townsend thought. Relax, he told the machines. Skynet has it under control. Steroids, having been still the entire time, moved towards the table where 2 of the 3 Greys present were sitting. Report to the armory, he ordered. When he saw the look of protest on their faces, he made his eyes glow an angry red and glared at them. Immediately, he added. There was an infinitesimal chance of John Connor surviving, but he was a machine and therefore didn't take chances. John looked out the window at the vast, seemingly endless Sierra crest, a range of mountains that just kept going and going as far as he could see. Somewhere ahead of them, he thought, was his mom and Skynet. Jesus Christ! The pilot shouted out from the cockpit. 6 heads snapped towards him and 12 eyes watched the man. What's going on? Ellison asked. Cameron didn't wait to find out. She moved into the front and sat in the co-pilot's seat next to him. John leaned over her shoulder between the 2 of them and saw the radar screen. 12 blips just appeared on radar coming right for us, 12 o'clock. The pilot explained aloud for those who couldn't see what was happening. 20 miles away and closing fast. HK drones, Danny said, feeling the blood drain from his face. He'd seen what those things could do. We've got to turn back. We go all the way, John snapped. There was no backing out now. They were committed. I'm hitting the deck, the pilot announced. Try to disappear off their radars. He pushed the yoke down and started to descend, but Cameron grabbed his hand and pulled the control stick back up. No, she insisted. Maintain course. Are you high? Knowles shouted at her. They're gonna blow us out of the sky. Ellison agreed with their new allies' sentiments, as did Savannah, who'd lived through the time when every human air force had been crushed like bugs. The machines ruled the skies in her time, and in this one they at least owned this little bit of it. We don't have a chance against them, she insisted. Trust me, Cameron said. John looked at her face and saw that same look in her eyes he'd seen before. She was up to something. Keep going dead ahead, John ordered the pilot. 17 miles, the pilot said, protest in his voice. The radar beeped again and he looked down with dread. More contacts on our 6. Fuck, Savannah shouted out. More HK drones, Danny shook his head, resigned. He didn't realize they'd built that many of the things. An alarm wailed shrilly inside the helicopter and the pilot almost jumped out of his seat. Missiles incoming. Cameron turned back to face everyone in the rear. They're not Skynets, she winked at John and Savannah, knowing they'd understand. She pushed down on the yoke and sent the helicopter into a steep descent. Missiles tore past them through the air, so fast and so close the helicopter shook in their wake. Reapers tore past the slow-flying helicopter, unleashing more missiles at the dragonflies, which moved to evade them. 3 of the otherworldly drones were obliterated outright in the opening salvo, and the Reapers accelerated to engage their new targets. You're doing that. Ellison asked Cameron, watching wide-eyed at the aerial battle raging around them as UCAVs attacked drones. Unmanned aircraft twisted, turned, and looped around each other. The distances closed too much for a shooting match. They had to resort to dogfights. Nice. Savannah grinned broadly. She watched as a delta-shaped X-45 turned in on a close circle, positioned itself behind a dragonfly and blasted it out of the air. She knew Cameron had controlled the things in the future, but seeing it up close like this was unreal. She was tempted to grab the machine gun, open the door, and take a few potshots herself. Now hit the deck, Cameron instructed the pilot as she stared forward blankly, concentrating intently on controlling and coordinating her squadron. The helicopter descended low, twisted and turned sharply, throwing the occupants inside around as the fight raged on above them. Cameron found herself grateful for the experiences of controlling the UCAVs in the future, or else her task would be overwhelming. She could see not just with her own eyes, but everything her aircraft saw. She was as aware as if she was the aircraft herself, but she was controlling more of them at once than she ever had, and it was difficult. The Reapers were slower and much less agile than Skynet's HK drones, and she only had 4 X-45s. She flew 2 UCAVs close to the helicopter, one above and one to the side, to provide them with an escort as Reapers and X-45s danced a deadly tango with Skynet's aircraft. Brother and sister AIs engaged in deadly air-to-air combat. "I think I'm going to piss myself if this keeps up," Danny said. "Don't," Savannah snapped at him. She turned to the pilot, who was concentrating on getting them the hell away from the vicious air war above them. "How long until we get where we're going?" she asked. 10 minutes. That's if we're not blown out of the air first." "We won't be," John told him, placing an arm on Cameron's shoulder and smiling down at her. He watched the scene above as a dragonfly unleashed 2 missiles and shattered 2 Reapers and turned towards them. "Cameron!" He started nervously as the aircraft loomed closer. "I see it," she replied, and struggled to maneuver an X-45 into a firing position. She flew one of the escorts away from the helicopter as the Skynet drone loosed another missile. The defending aircraft headed straight for the incoming shot, and at the last second turned upwards, slowing down and exposing its fuselage, forcing the missile to lock onto it instead of the chopper. Missile and UCAV detonated in a bright flash of flame and an eruption of smoke, a near miss that they couldn't afford to risk again. The other X-45 approached its target, and the Dragonfly disengaged, taking evasive action to avoid being shot down. The helicopter went lower and dropped down into the range, using the mountains as cover as the pilot decided to try and hide from, rather than outrun the aircraft, and quickly left the aerial battle behind. Skynet drones attempted to give chase, but Cameron had numerical superiority and managed to keep them too preoccupied, forcing them to fight her squadron instead of attacking their intended target and keeping a distance between the dogfights and themselves. The ride smoothed out finally, and they kept low as they continued on their course. "Put us down here," John told the pilot after 7 of his pronounced 10 minutes. "We're still a mile and a half from the complex," he protested. "Do it," Cameron repeated his order. The pilot sighed and lowered them down to the nearest level ground he could find. Knowles knew what John was thinking. "Go in by foot and sneak up on them," he said, as the chopper touched the rocky ground and the pilot flipped several switches, slowing down the rapidly spinning rotors. "Quietly!" Savannah opened the door and stepped outside, sighing with relief as her boots touched solid ground. A split second after they did, she ran out several meters from the helicopter and dropped prone to the ground, searching for any signs of defenders. Knowles followed after her and took up position to her right, and one by one they all did the same, taking cover behind rocky outcrops away from the helicopter, until only John remained inside the bird with the pilot. "I wouldn't take off anytime soon," John told him, sounding like it was friendly advice, but there was a clear order beneath it all, displayed in his eyes and on his face. "Kaliba's a mile and a half due north," the pilot told him. He stuck a hand out ahead of him. "Just keep going and you'll see it." John took his weapons, checked the helicopter was empty and jumped out, moving away from it as the others came towards him. "Looks clear," Savannah said, still watching out ahead of them in case they were wrong. Engine noise flared up suddenly, whining loudly, and everyone turned their heads to see the helicopter pulling up into the air. "Get back here!" Savannah shouted at the pilot and started to run back towards the aircraft. It lifted up out of reach before she got there, and she raised her rifle to take aim at its undercarriage. "No," John pushed her arm down before she could pull the trigger. "Let him go," he shrugged. The pilot had lost his nerve and decided to break away. There was nothing they could do about it. In the distance, he could still see the dogfights raging through the air as Reapers. X-45s and HK drones spun and curled, twisted and turned, leaving contrails in their wake and blasting missiles at each other, leaving trails of smoke that shot out ahead of the drones. Flashes erupted in the air as missiles found their marks, though from this distance it was too hard to tell whether it was Cameron's drones or Skynet's that were winning. One of the aircraft broke away from the fight and tore straight towards the helicopter as it approached the Kaliba complex, coming close enough for John to recognize its sleek, sharp, and almost insect-like shape. The Dragonfly closed in on the helicopter, with no escorts to protect it, and with the remainder of Cameron's squadron still fighting the other HK drones, it reached missile range unchallenged. The Dragonfly loosed off a missile that shot high over John's head and smashed into the chopper, igniting its fuel supply and consuming the helicopter and its pilot in a blossoming ball of fire that crashed down to Earth. "Hide!" Cameron shouted at them and grabbed John, throwing him and then herself into a crevice just large enough for them both to fit inside. Everyone else immediately ran for cover as the Dragonfly flew closer, hiding beneath rocky outcrops and against ledges and boulders, hoping they'd be shielded from the drone's view. It flew on overhead and looped around, swinging back the way it had come from to rejoin the aerial battle. "We're clear," Savannah called out as she got up from her hiding place. Cameron pulled herself out from the crevice and gave John a hand out after her. "How do we get back now?" Danny asked. This was the middle of nowhere, and the mountain range looked nothing short of treacherous. He just hoped some of Kaliba's other helicopters were still at the complex. "We'll worry about that later," Ellison told him. "Forget about it." "We've got a 1.5-mile hike ahead of us," Knowles said as he shouldered his HKG-36, the other weapons slung over his back, and he started to take the lead. "Let's get moving." John cleared his throat loudly and deliberately, cutting the ex-Marine short. "I'm in charge," he said flatly. Knowles stared at him, incredulous. John Connor was just a kid, but he had a hardness beyond his years, like someone who'd lived through nothing but shit their whole lives. Still, he was just a kid. "You don't exactly look like you've got a lot of experience, kid." John couldn't help the dry, humorless smirk that split his lips. "Looks can be deceiving," he said. He couldn't be bothered to explain exactly what experience they had. They could swap war stories after they'd rescued his mom safely. "If you don't like it, it's a long walk home." "John's in charge," Cameron confirmed. Savannah nodded her assent, as did Ellison. "They know what they're doing," Danny said to Knowles. The former Kaliba mercenary hesitated for a moment. He'd been expecting to join forces with Sarah, but instead found her son and a band of... Well, none of them looked like they'd been in the military, he thought. Granted, the one called Cameron was a Terminator, but he didn't like having to take orders from some unknown. The last time that it happened, he'd realized he was working for tin cans and people conspiring to blow up the world. Still, they'd all agreed to follow John's orders. Chances were he'd get no cooperation if he tried to take charge. "Sure thing, kid," he said. "Squad's yours." "Move north," John said, taking the pilot's directions. "Savannah, take point and scout ahead." With only a nod in reply, the redhead jogged ahead and disappeared behind a large boulder as the rest of them set off at a slower pace. Cameron, still controlling the air war in the sky a few miles away, looked at John as he marched quickly and smiled. It was a different timeline to the one she'd come from, the same enemy but a different war, and once again John was taking the fight to Skynet. Again, he was about to storm the heart of the AI and destroy it. She knew his doubts and insecurities, but she also saw he was, albeit in a different way, fulfilling his fate as the man who would defeat Skynet. History was about to repeat itself, and John Connor was ready for it. She had no doubt he would succeed.